The world had run out of color. It was a thing of whites and grays, a canvas of endless aching emptiness that stretched from one bruised horizon to the next. The wind, a restless spirit with a voice like an old woman's mourning, swept across the Wyoming plains, sculpting the snow into waves that broke against the wheels of the wagons. It was a sound that got inside a person, a low and constant howl that promised nothing but a deeper cold, a more profound loneliness. Dusk was not so much arriving as it was seeping up from the frozen earth, a final stain of gray that swallowed the last of the weak afternoon light. The wagon tracks they left behind were shallow, desperate scars, and with every gust, the snow worked to erase them, to pretend they had never been there at all. Inside the covered wagon, Clara Mae Thompson pulled her thin wool shawl tighter around her shoulders, the cold a living thing that pressed in from all sides. Her breath plumed in front of her face, a fragile ghost in the dim air. For 3 weeks, this rolling canvas box had been her home, her church, her whole world. Outside it, there was only the wind and the white. She clutched the worn letter in her pocket, the paper softened by the constant touch of her fingers. Mr. Alistair Finch, her husband. The name still felt foreign on her tongue. The word husband, a garment that did not quite fit. She had his picture, a stern, unsmiling man with a thick beard and eyes that looked out from the tintype as if judging the world and finding it wanting. He owned a ranch. The letter had said, "Good land, watered by a creek that never ran dry." He needed a wife to make a home, a companion against the silence. She had been sold, in a way, not for coin, but for the promise of survival. After her father's farm had been choked to dust and buried by the prairie, there had been nothing left but a name and the clothes on her back. The arrangement, made by a distant aunt, was a practical one. He got a wife, she got a roof over her head and food in her belly. Love was a luxury for people in stories, not for a woman whose hands were calloused from pulling weeds and whose heart was a quiet, shuttered room. Still, a stubborn splinter of hope had lodged itself deep inside her. Hope for a life that was not constantly on the verge of blowing away. Hope for a quiet corner of the world to call her own. The small convoy, 2 freight wagons and her own, had been a comfort. There was Mr. Hemlock, the lead driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles and whose voice was a low rumble. There was the Miller family in the other wagon, with their 2 young boys who chased each other in circles at every stop, their laughter like tiny, bright bells in the vast emptiness. Clara had shared coffee with Mrs. Miller that very morning, the steam from their tin cups mingling in the frigid air. They had talked of gardens and jam, of the small, ordinary things that made up a life. The first shot was a sharp, ugly crack that tore through the song of the wind. It was so sudden, so out of place, that for a heartbeat, Clara thought a tree had split from the cold. Then came another, and a man's scream, high and ragged. The wagon lurched to a violent halt. Mrs. Miller's shriek was cut short. The world outside the canvas flap dissolved into a chaos of noise, gunfire, the terrified whinny of horses, guttural shouts that were not in English. Clara did not think. Her body moved on instinct, a terrified animal seeking cover. She scrambled over a trunk and tumbled out the back of the wagon, landing hard in the deep snow that cushioned her fall. The cold was a shock, a slap to the face. Without a thought, she wriggled beneath the wagon bed, pressing her body against the frozen axle, her face mashed into the snow. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to make herself smaller, to disappear. The fight was a nightmare of sounds and brief, terrible images glimpsed from under the wagon, heavy boots stomping through the snow. So close she could feel the vibration. A shadow fell, and Mr. Hemlock crumpled to the ground just feet from her hiding place, a dark stain blossoming on the front of his buckskin jacket. His eyes were open, staring with a dull surprise at the gray sky that had betrayed him. The Miller boys, she heard one of them cry for his mother, a sound that was brutally silenced. And then, as suddenly as it began, It was over. The gunfire stopped. The shouting faded, replaced by low, urgent muttering. The air smelled of gunpowder and something else, something metallic and warm that cut through the clean scent of the snow. The only sound left was the relentless, indifferent wind. It seemed an eternity that she lay there, frozen in place, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The warmth seeping into the front of her dress was not her own. She realized with a sickening lurch that she had fallen in the snow where Mr. Hemlock's blood was pooling, the life draining out of him to stain the ground a terrible, vivid red. Her breath hitched in a sob she could not release. They were all gone. The bells of laughter, the rumbling voice, the talk of gardens, all erased. The silence stretched on. She could hear the crunch of boots nearby, the sound of men ransacking the wagons, their movements unhurried now. She prayed they would not look under here. She prayed they would take what they wanted and leave. She prayed to a God she was no longer sure was listening. Finally, the sounds receded. She heard the jingle of harnesses, the snort of horses, and the muffled thud of hooves as they rode away, swallowed by the swirling snow. Still, she did not move. Time lost all meaning. There was only the cold, the wind, and the stiffening body of the man beside her. She might have lain there until she froze solid, a monument of fear. But a new sound broke the spell. A single set of footsteps, heavy and uneven, crunching back toward her. One of them had returned. The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through her. This was it. He was coming to finish the job. She held her breath, listening. The steps were slow, dragging. A low groan followed, a sound of pure agony. The footsteps stopped right beside the wagon. She saw a pair of worn leather boots, caked with snow and mud, a dark trouser leg. Then a hand, gloved and grimy, gripped the edge of the wagon bed. A face appeared, upside down, peering into the shadows beneath. It was a hard face, framed by shaggy, dark hair matted with snow. A thick beard covered his jaw, but it could not hide the grim set of his mouth or the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. They were dark eyes, and in their depths, she saw a universe of pain. There was a long, bloody gash on his temple, and his left arm was pressed tight against his side, the sleeve of his coat dark and wet with more than melted snow. He saw her. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise in the weary depths. A pistol appeared in his other hand, the barrel a perfect black circle of death. He aimed it at her face. Clara's whole body went rigid. A small, choked sound escaped her throat. She could not scream. She could only stare into the black hole of the barrel and wait for the end. He held the gun steady, his knuckles white. His gaze was intense, searching. He saw the terror in her eyes, the blood on her dress, the way she trembled like a trapped bird. The seconds stretched, each one a lifetime. The wind howled, whipping snow around them. He blinked, a slow, tired movement, and then he lowered the gun. Not by much, just an inch, but it was enough. The immediate threat of death receded, replaced by a cold, sharp dread. "Get out!" he rasped, his voice a rough, gravelly sound, torn from a raw throat. Clara shook her head, unable to form words. She was pinned by fear, her limbs refusing to obey. He let out an impatient hiss of breath, the sound turning to a white cloud in the air. "I said, get out, now!" He winced, a tremor of pain running through his body, and leaned heavily against the wagon wheel. "The storm's turning. We stay here. We both die." He was one of them, a killer, a monster who had slaughtered these people without a thought. But the man looking at her now was not a monster. He was a wounded animal, desperate and dangerous. She saw no malice in his eyes, only a grim, bone-deep weariness and a fierce, primal will to live. It was that will that frightened her more than the gun. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible. "Leave me be." A flicker of anger crossed his face. There ain't no leavin' be out here, lady. There's livin' and there's dyin'. Make a choice." He did not wait for her answer. He reached under the wagon, his gloved hand clamping around her arm like a manacle. His grip was surprisingly strong, fueled by desperation. He pulled. Clara cried out, kicking and struggling, but it was useless. She was weak from cold and fear, and he dragged her out from under the wagon as if she were a sack of flour. She stumbled to her feet in the deep snow, the full horror of the scene hitting her for the first time. The bodies lay where they had fallen, already being dusted with a fresh shroud of white. The horses were gone. The wagons were open, their contents strewn about. They were alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone in a world that had become a graveyard. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "My husband, he's waiting for me. Just let me go." "Your husband is a ghost if you stay here," the man growled. He grabbed her shawl, which had fallen to the ground, and thrust it at her. Then he seized her arm again, tighter this time. "There's a cabin in the hills, an old trapper's place. It ain't far." "I won't go with you," she spat, finding a sliver of defiance in her terror. She clawed at his hand, her nails scraping uselessly against the thick leather of his glove. "You murderer! You killed them!" His face hardened, the brief flicker of humanity extinguished. "Keep moving," he ordered, and gave her a rough shove forward, toward the low, timbered hills that were faint shadows in the thickening storm. The journey was a blur of misery. Every step was a battle. The snow was up to their knees in places, and the wind was a physical force, shoving and tearing at them, stealing the air from their lungs. Clara fought him the whole way. She twisted and pulled. She threatened him with damnation. She pleaded for the memory of the dead. He ignored it all. He was a silent, relentless force, his grip on her arm unbreakable. His own movements were labored. She could hear his ragged, painful breathing and see the way he favored his wounded side. He was as close to the edge as she was. She fell, her legs giving out from under her. The snow was soft for a moment, and then just cold. She did not want to get up. It would be so easy to lie here, to let the white silence take her. It would be peaceful. He hauled her back to her feet, his face close to hers, his breath smelling of blood and cold air. "You die when I say you can die," he snarled, his voice raw with effort. "Not before." He half carried her after that, his arm hooked around her waist, her feet dragging through the snow. She was an anchor, and he was a sinking ship, but he refused to let go. The sky grew darker. The snow fell thicker, a blinding curtain that closed them off from the world. She lost all sense of direction, all sense of time. There was only the struggle, the cold, and the iron grip of the man who was forcing her to live. Just when she was sure she could not take another step, that her heart would simply stop from the strain, a shape loomed out of the swirling white, a dark rectangle against the gray. The cabin. It was small, crude, barely more than a shack, with a low roof heavy with snow. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He practically kicked the door open, the wood groaning in protest. It swung inward into a single, dark room. He shoved her inside before stumbling in after her, slamming the door shut against the wailing wind. The sudden silence was shocking. The darkness was absolute. They stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, their chests heaving. The air was frigid, smelling of old wood smoke, dust and damp earth. "Flint," he grunted. "By the hearth. Find it." Clara's hands were numb, her fingers like clumsy sticks. But she fumbled along the rough stone of the fireplace until she found a small tin box. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely strike the flint against the steel. Sparks flew, feeble and short-lived. On the fourth try, a spark caught on the piece of charcloth. She blew on it gently, coaxing the tiny ember into a fragile flame, and used it to light the wick of a tallow candle stub she found on the mantel. The small, flickering light pushed back the darkness, revealing the pitiful interior. A rough-hewn table, One rickety chair, a pile of furs in a corner that served as a bed, and a stone hearth filled with old ashes. It was a shelter, nothing more. The man had not moved from the door. He leaned against it, his head bowed, his broad shoulders slumped. The small candlelight illuminated the dark, wet patch on his coat, far larger than she had realized. He had been bleeding this whole time, losing his life drop by drop into the snow. He slid the heavy wooden bar across the door, the sound loud and final in the small space. He had locked them in. He had locked the storm out and locked her in. He took 2 unsteady steps toward the fire, and then his legs buckled. He fell to his knees. Catching himself with one hand on the stone hearth, he stayed there for a long moment, his whole body trembling with exhaustion and pain. Clara watched him, her fear warring with a strange, unwelcome flicker of pity. He was not a demon. He was just a man, broken and bleeding on her floor. A man who had dragged her through a frozen hell to this miserable little room. He slowly, painfully, turned his head to look at her. His eyes found hers in the flickering gloom, and in them she saw the full weight of what he had done, of what they had become to each other in the space of an hour, captor and captive, sinner and witness. A cold certainty settled over her, chilling her more than the wind ever could. This was not the end of her ordeal. It was the beginning of something else, something unknown and terrible. She looked at the barred door, at the dying man by the fire, at the storm that raged outside, and a single, quiet sentence formed in her mind and slipped past her lips, a whisper that was both a curse and a prophecy. "You'll regret this." His only answer was a low groan as he finally surrendered to the pain, slumping forward and collapsing onto the dusty floorboards beside the hearth. The candle flame danced, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. The night closed in around them, absolute and unforgiving, the wind shrieking its lonely, terrible song. The fire had died to a bed of sullen, glowing embers, offering little more than a whisper of warmth against the oppressive cold of the cabin. Jack lay on the floor, a dark, motionless heap. For a long while, Clara simply stood, watching the slow, shallow rise and fall of his chest. He was not dead. The thought brought her no relief, only a cold, practical clarity. This was her chance. Her movements were stiff, her muscles screaming in protest as she crept toward the door. The heavy wooden bar was frosted with ice near the edges. It took all of her strength, her fingers numb and clumsy, to lift it from its brackets. The wood scraped with a sound that seemed as loud as a gunshot in the profound silence. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, her eyes locked on the man by the hearth. He did not stir. She pulled the door open just enough to slip through, and the storm met her like a physical blow. The wind tore the breath from her lungs, its shriek 1,000 accusing voices. The snow was a blinding, suffocating white, a swirling chaos that had no top or bottom. She took 3 steps, and the cabin was swallowed behind her. She was in a world with no landmarks, no direction, only the brutal, relentless cold. It was a foolish, desperate act, and she knew it almost immediately. The snow was deeper than she had imagined, a thick, soft trap that clung to her skirts and dragged her down. Within minutes, the cold was no longer on her skin. It was inside her, sinking its teeth into her bones. Her face was numb, her hands were useless clubs, and a dangerous, seductive lethargy began to creep over her. The thought of simply lying down, of closing her eyes and letting the white peace take her, was overwhelmingly tempting. It was the memory of Mr. Hemlock's surprised, dead eyes that kept her moving. She would not die out here. She would not let this place be her grave. She had no idea how she found her way back. Perhaps she had only stumbled in a tight circle. But suddenly, the dark shape of the cabin was there again, a phantom in the storm. She fell against the door, fumbling for the handle, her body racked with violent, uncontrollable shivers. She tumbled inside, dragging a swirl of snow in with her, and managed to push the door closed, slumping against it, too weak to even drop the bar back in place. She lay on the floor, gasping, the relative warmth of the cabin a new kind of pain against her frozen skin. It was a long time before she could muster the strength to crawl toward the hearth. She added a few small pieces of wood to the embers, her movements clumsy, and blew until a weak flame flickered to life. A rough cough from the other side of the hearth made her jump. Jack was stirring. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his eyes blinking open. They were clouded with fever, unfocused and wild. He saw her, a dark shape huddled by his fire, and his hand instinctively went to the pistol still tucked in his belt. "What'd you do?" he rasped, his voice thick with suspicion. Clara shrank back. "Nothing." "You try to kill me?" He struggled to sit up, his face contorting in pain. "Wait for me to bleed out and then take your chances with the storm." The injustice of the accusation, after she had nearly frozen to death, ignited a spark of fury in her. "I should have," she said, her voice trembling with cold and rage. "I should have put your own gun to your head while you slept, you animal. It would have been a mercy." "Get away from the fire," he growled, raising the pistol. His hand was unsteady, but the threat was real. "I will not," she said, her chin lifting. "I will die of the cold if I do. Go on then. Shoot me. At least I will not have to look at the face of a murderer a moment longer." The word hung in the air between them, ugly and sharp. His face darkened, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "You keep using that word," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't know a thing about me. You don't know what happened out there." "I know what I saw," she cried, the images flooding back, the bodies, the blood, the laughter of the Miller boys silenced forever. "I saw you and your filth slaughter innocent people. For what? A few dollars? A bag of flour? You are less than a man. You are a monster." He spat a curse, the sound venomous. "Shut your mouth. You think you know everything, sitting in your wagon, on your way to your cozy life with your rancher husband? You know nothing about this world." "I know the difference between right and wrong," she shot back. "Do you?" He gave a short, bitter laugh that turned into a grimace of pain. He leaned back against the wall, the gun lowering slightly as a wave of dizziness seemed to wash over him. "There ain't no right and wrong out here. There's just what a man's got to do to keep breathing." "That is what a coward says to justify his sins," she whispered. He looked at her then, and for a moment, the feverish anger in his eyes was replaced by a deep, hollow ache that startled her. My gang," he said, the words costing him an enormous effort. "They turned. It wasn't supposed to go that way. They got spooked. They just started shooting." He shook his head, a gesture of profound weariness. "I didn't pull the trigger, not on your people." Clara stared at him, her heart a cold, tight knot in her chest. It was a lie. It had to be a lie. A pathetic attempt to save his own soul in her eyes, and yet, the way he said it, the raw pain that edged his voice, it felt like a splinter of truth. She did not want to believe him. To believe him would be to complicate everything, to soften the edges of her righteous hatred. It was easier to see him as a monster. "Liar," she said, but the word had lacked the conviction it had held just moments before. She saw the flash of hurt in his eyes before the anger slammed back into place. He said nothing more, turning his face away from her and staring into the fire, his jaw set like stone. The storm raged for 3 more days. It was a constant, shrieking presence that sealed them in their tiny prison. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the cabin, the fire, and the silent, heavy tension between them. Time was measured by the dwindling pile of firewood and the gnawing hunger in their bellies. On the 2nd day, he directed her to a loose floorboard near the back wall. Beneath it was a small cache of supplies left by the trapper, a slab of salt-cured venison, a half-full bag of dried beans, and a small sack of coffee. It was not much, but it was enough to keep them alive. They ate in silence, seated on opposite sides of the hearth, the small fire a fragile truce between them. Each bite was a reminder of their shared, desperate state. His fever worsened. By the third night, he was shivering uncontrollably, his skin hot to the touch, the wound in his side. She could see now when he shifted, had begun to look angry and inflamed around the edges of the crude bandage he had tied around it. He would die if it festered. The thought should have brought her a grim satisfaction, but instead, it filled her with a strange, unwelcome anxiety. His death would leave her truly alone, and she was no longer certain she could survive that. "The bullet's still in there," he muttered late that night, his voice slurred by the fever. "Gotta come out." Clara looked at her own small sewing kit, which she had managed to grab from the wagon. It held a few sturdy needles and spools of thread. The thought of what she would have to do made her stomach turn. "I am not a doctor," she said, her voice thin. "Don't need a doctor," he breathed, his eyes closed. "Just need a steady hand." He was asking her. The man who had taken everything from her was now placing his life in her hands. She did not know why she agreed. Perhaps it was some deep-seated instinct to heal, to mend what was broken. Perhaps it was simply that she could not sit and watch a man die, not even this man. Reluctantly, she moved to his side. "I will need whiskey, if there is any, and you will have to open your coat." He directed her to a small flask in his saddlebag. He took a long, shuddering pull from it before handing it to her. She poured a little of the raw spirit onto a strip of cloth torn from her petticoat and used it to clean one of her sewing needles in the firelight. He gritted his teeth as he unbuttoned his coat and shirt, exposing the wound. It was a ragged, ugly tear in the flesh of his side, the skin around it bruised and swollen. But it was not the fresh wound that made her gasp. His torso was a landscape of old scars. A long, puckered line ran from his collarbone down his chest, the work of a knife. A cluster of small, round scars dotted his shoulder, likely from buckshot. There were others, faint and white with age, crisscrossing his skin like ancient roads. This was not a man who had simply fallen into a life of crime. This was a man who had been raised by it, a man whose entire existence had been a punishment. "Just get it done," he said through clenched teeth, his eyes squeezed shut. Her hands trembled as she probed the wound with the tip of a small knife she had sterilized. He did not make a sound, but his entire body went rigid, beads of sweat breaking out on his forehead. She found the piece of lead lodged against a rib and, with a sickening scrape, managed to pry it out. He let out a long, ragged breath, his body slumping in relief. Then came the worst part. She threaded the needle, her fingers feeling clumsy and thick. "This will hurt," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It always does," he replied, his voice strained. She took a deep breath and pushed the needle through his skin. He flinched, a low groan escaping his lips, but he did not cry out. She sewed the flesh closed with small, tight stitches. Her own breath held tight in her chest. She was keenly aware of the heat coming off his skin, the solid feel of the muscle beneath her fingers, the faint smell of sweat, blood, and whiskey. In that moment, he was not her captor, not a murderer. He was just a man, broken and bleeding, and she was the only thing holding him together. When she was finished, she cleaned the area as best she could and bandaged it tightly with more strips of cloth. He was pale and shaking, but his breathing was already easier. He mumbled a thank you so low she almost did not hear it. She retreated to her side of the fire, her hands still shaking from the ordeal. They did not speak for the rest of the night. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the ceaseless howl of the wind. But the silence was different now. The sharp edges of their hatred had been dulled. They were two prisoners, trapped together in the belly of the storm. She was a prisoner of his actions, and he was a prisoner of his own life, of the guilt that radiated from him like a fever. On the morning of the fourth day, she awoke to a strange and unfamiliar silence. The wind had finally died. A faint, watery sunlight filtered through a small, grimy window pane high on the wall. casting a pale stripe across the floor. The storm had broken. She got up and unbarred the door. Pushing it open, the world outside was transformed. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the snow that covered everything glittered as if it were sewn with diamonds. The air was clean and cold and still. The beauty of it was so vast, so pure, it made her ache. Freedom was out there, a path away from this cabin, away from him. She turned to look back inside. Jack was awake, watching her. His fever had broken, and his eyes, though still shadowed with pain and exhaustion, were clear. He looked at her, then at the open door and the bright, clean world beyond it. He said nothing, but a question hung in the air between them. Clara looked back out at the endless expanse of white. She could leave now. She could walk away and never look back. But the snow was deep, and the nearest town was days away. And the man inside, the man whose life she had just saved, would surely die without her. A fragile, unspoken warmth had begun to form in the cold, cramped space between them. A bond forged in shared desperation and reluctant mercy. It was not trust, and it certainly was not forgiveness, but it was something, and for now, it was enough to make her stay. She pulled the door closed, shutting out the cold, and went back to the fire. The end of the storm left behind a world scrubbed clean and silent. The sky was a vast, aching blue, and the sun on the snow was so bright it hurt the eyes. From the cabin door, Clara could see the endless landscape of the mountains, their peaks sharp and white against the horizon, their slopes cloaked in the deep green of pine trees heavy with snow. It was a beauty so profound and so desolate, it felt like a kind of judgment. In the sharp, still air, the howl of a wolf pack drifted up from the valley below, a lonely and mournful sound that served as a reminder that this beautiful world was not a gentle one. It was a place of hunger and survival, and they were trespassers in it. The small supply of food was nearly gone. Jack, moving with a stiff and painful slowness, took the trapper's old rifle down from its pegs on the wall. He checked the action, his movements economical and practiced. His fever was gone, but he was still weak, his face pale and drawn beneath his beard. "I am going to hunt," he said. It was not a question or a request for permission, but a simple statement of fact. "Bar the door behind me. Do not open it for any reason unless you hear me give 3 quick knocks." A pause, and then one more. He looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers for a moment. He was giving her a choice. With him gone, she would be alone, unwatched. The door would be barred from the inside. He was trusting her not to run. Or perhaps he simply knew, as she did, that running was a fool's errand. He stepped outside, and she slid the heavy bar into place. The sound echoed in the sudden emptiness of the cabin. She was alone for the first time since the ambush. The silence was a heavy blanket. She walked to the small, grimy window and watched his dark figure moving slowly through the deep snow, the rifle resting in the crook of his good arm. He grew smaller and smaller, until he was just a black speck against the blinding white. And then he disappeared into the trees. The debate that raged inside her was a silent, furious thing. She could go. She could pack the last of the salted meat and try to make her way back toward the wagon trail. Someone would come looking for the convoy eventually. A search party, the army, someone. But the snow was a treacherous, unbroken sea. She had no idea how far she would have to walk, or in which direction. The memory of the paralyzing cold from her first escape attempt was a fresh and potent fear. The wolf's howl echoed in her mind. And what of him? He had saved her from the storm. She had saved him from the festering wound. A strange and unwelcome ledger had been opened between them. To leave now would be to condemn him to death, a slow and lonely end in this isolated cabin. Was that not the justice he deserved for his part in the slaughter? Her mind screamed yes, but a quieter, more confusing voice in her heart whispered no. She saw not the outlaw, but the man with a body full of old scars, The man who had gritted his teeth in silence while she sewed his flesh together. She spent the day in a state of restless indecision, cleaning the cabin, stoking the fire, her ears straining for any sound from outside. As the afternoon light began to fade, painting the snow in shades of pink and orange, a new fear began to creep in. What if he did not come back? What if he had succumbed to his wound, or been taken by the cold, or found by a wolf? The thought of being left here to slowly starve, to face the vast, indifferent wilderness alone, was a terror far greater than the one he inspired. The sun had slipped behind the peaks, and the world was sinking into a deep blue twilight when she heard it. 3 quick knocks. A pause. 1 more. Her heart leapt into her throat. She scrambled to the door, her hands fumbling with the heavy bar. She pulled it open, and he was there, leaning against the door frame, his face gray with exhaustion. A thin crust of ice clung to his beard, and his cheeks were a raw, angry red from the cold. But slung over his shoulder were 2 snowshoe hares, their white fur already stained with frozen blood. He was alive. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees washed over her. She hid it immediately, stepping back to let him in, her expression carefully neutral. "You were gone a long time," she said, her voice flat. "The hunting is lean," he replied, his own voice rough with fatigue. He dropped the rabbits onto the table and slumped into the single chair, his head falling into his hands. She saw that the fingers on his left hand were white and waxy with frostbite. Without a word, she took a bowl and filled it with snow from just outside the door. She brought it to him and guided his hand into the bowl, her touch surprisingly gentle. He looked up at her, his eyes full of a weary surprise. They sat in silence as she slowly, carefully, rubbed his fingers with the snow, bringing the life back into them. The process was painful, and he winced, but he did not pull away. That night, after they had eaten, the roasted meat a feast that filled the small cabin with a rich, savory smell. The silence between them felt different. It was not the tense, angry silence of before, but something quieter, more thoughtful. The fire crackled and hissed, a cheerful counterpoint to the deep stillness of the mountains. "Why do you do it?" Clara asked, her voice soft. She did not need to specify what she meant. Jack stared into the flames for a long time before he answered. "When you ain't got nothing, you take what you need to survive, and when they take everything from you, survival becomes a kind of revenge." He shifted, his shoulder brushing against the rough logs of the cabin wall. "My family had a small farm. Good land. My PA built the house with his own hands. Then the railroad decided they wanted to come through our valley. They offered us pennies for it. My PA, he was a proud man. He told them to go to hell." His voice was low and devoid of emotion, as if he were reciting a story he had told himself 1,000 times. They came back a week later, not with money, but with men carrying rifles and legal papers that said our land was theirs. My PA stood on the porch. My ma was behind him. They wouldn't leave. So they burned it. They burned the house down with them inside it. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. My brother, Samuel, he was younger than me. He saw it all. He was never right after that. A few months later, one of the railroad foremen was found dead. They said Samuel did it, strung him up from a cottonwood tree without a trial, without a shred of proof. I was the only one left. There was nothing for me to do but run and learn to be the kind of man they thought my brother was. The story settled in the small room, a weight as heavy and cold as the stones of the hearth. For the first time, Clara saw the full and terrible shape of the man sitting across from her, a man forged in a fire of grief and injustice. A long silence passed. Then she heard her own voice, a near whisper, telling him things she had never spoken aloud to anyone. My father did not die in a fire. He died of thirst. We watched our farm turn to dust. The well went dry, then the creek. He just gave up, sat on the porch day after day, watching the sky. until one morning he just wasn't there anymore. He just wasn't. She looked down at her hands, twisting in her lap. My mother. She found a way for us to survive. She sold herself to a man in the town, a merchant, for food, for a roof over our heads. When he tired of her, he passed her on to another. One day, she just stopped talking. She was there, but she was gone, just an empty shell. She finally looked up, her eyes meeting his across the fire. This marriage, this Mr. Finch, it was arranged by an aunt I barely know, a letter and a photograph. That was to be my life, a stranger in a strange land. I never even wanted to answer it. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not pity, but a deep, resonant understanding. They were two sides of the same coin, both of them orphans of a harsh and unforgiving land. A small, wry smile touched his lips. Well, ain't we a fine pair, he said, his voice soft. Running from ghosts, the both of us. And then, something extraordinary happened. A small bubble of laughter escaped Clara's lips. It was a strange, watery sound, half sob, half laugh. He heard it, and a low chuckle rumbled in his own chest. For a moment, they just looked at each other, and the shared, bitter irony of their two ruined lives was so absurd, so immense, that they both laughed. It was not a loud or joyous sound. It was quiet and broken and achingly sad, but it was laughter. And in that small, flickering moment, the ice that had encased Clara's heart for so long began to crack. The next day, he took her outside into the brilliant sunshine. You need to know how to use this, he said, holding out the rifle. If something happens to me, you need to be able to protect yourself. She took the weapon. It was heavier than she expected, the wood smooth and cool beneath her fingers. He stood behind her, his voice a low murmur near her ear as he showed her how to hold it, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight down the long barrel. His closeness was unnerving, yet not threatening. He adjusted her stance, his hands resting briefly on her shoulders, and a strange warmth spread through her. Squeeze the trigger, he said. Do not pull it. She aimed at a blackened stump 100 yards away, held her breath, and squeezed. The rifle bucked against her shoulder with a deafening roar, and a puff of snow exploded just to the right of the stump. You flinched, he said. Try again. Do not think about the noise. Just see the target. She reloaded, her movements becoming less clumsy under his instruction. This time, she focused, the world narrowing to the V of the rifle's sight and the dark shape of the stump. She squeezed the trigger. A piece of bark flew from the center of the stump. Jack let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be, he said, a note of genuine admiration in his voice. You have a steady hand. Clara May. She felt a flush of pride, a feeling so foreign she barely recognized it. She was more than just a victim, more than just a survivor. She was strong. They were walking back to the cabin, the sun warm on their faces, when they heard it, the unmistakable sound of horses, several of them, moving through the snow in the valley below. Panic seized them both. Jack grabbed her arm, his eyes wide and alert. Inside, he hissed. Now! They scrambled into the cabin, and he barred the door. His movement swift and silent, he pressed his ear to the wall, listening. The sound of the horses grew closer. The floorboards, he said, his voice urgent. He dragged the table aside and pulled up the same loose board that had hidden the food. It revealed a shallow, dark space beneath the cabin, barely deep enough to crawl into. Get in! She did not hesitate. Dropping into the cold, dark space, it smelled of damp earth and spiders. Jack slid in after her, pulling the floorboard back into place above them, plunging them into near total darkness. The space was incredibly small. They were pressed together, her back against his chest, his arms on either side of her. She could feel the steady, heavy beat of his heart against her shoulder blades. The sound of the horses stopped directly outside the cabin. They heard the crunch of boots in the snow, the jingle of spurs, men's voices loud and clear, carried down through the floorboards. "Check inside," a voice commanded. "Caleb, you and Tom ride the perimeter. Look for tracks." They heard the door of the cabin being pushed, then kicked. "It is barred from the inside," another man called out. "Anyone in there?" the first voice shouted. "This is Marshal John Harding. We are looking for survivors of the wagon train attack." Clara held her breath. Jack's body was tense as a coiled spring behind her. "Probably just snowed in," a man grumbled from inside the cabin. "Doors swelled shut." They heard the men stomping around on the floorboards just inches above their heads. Every creak of the wood sent a fresh wave of terror through Clara. "Nothing here, Marshal," the man inside called. "Fire's cold. Looks like no one's been here for weeks." "Damn it," the marshal swore. "The trail went cold right in this valley. Figured we would find something." "What about the rumor, Marshal?" another man asked as they gathered outside again. "The one we heard from that trapper downriver? That Silas Blackwood himself was leading that raid, and that his own men turned on him and put a bullet in his back?" Beneath the floor, Clara felt Jack go utterly still. "Just a rumor," the marshal said, his voice dismissive. "Silas is too smart to get himself killed by his own men. Still, with him dead or alive, that is one less wolf on the prairie. All right, let us move out. There is nothing for us here." They listened as the men mounted their horses and rode away, the sound of their departure slowly fading until there was only silence. They waited for a long time, not moving, not breathing, until they were sure they were gone. Jack pushed the floorboard aside and climbed out, helping her up after him. In the dim light of the cabin, she saw his face. He was not relieved. He was pale, and there was a look in his eyes she had not seen before, a cold, shaken fury. He was not the leader of the gang, but the world, it seemed, was being told that he was. Someone had left him behind to take the fall. He looked at her, at the fear and confusion on her face. He did not have to say a word. In that moment, Clara knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that he had been telling the truth all along. He was a thief, an outlaw, a man running from the law. But he was not the monster who had murdered her companions in the snow. The real monster was still out there, and he had just given Jack a new name. The silence in the cabin had changed. It was no longer the empty, watchful silence of two strangers bound by circumstance, but a thick, charged quiet that hummed with unspoken words. The space, which had once seemed a barely adequate shelter, now felt impossibly small, shrinking with every day that passed. They had fallen into a rhythm, a domestic pattern that felt both natural and deeply unsettling. She would tend the fire while he checked his snares. He would chop wood while she boiled coffee. They moved around each other with a practiced grace, their bodies so aware of the other's presence that they rarely brushed against each other. Yet the air between them crackled with the energy of 1,000 near touches. There were glances, too, across the small table, over the flickering firelight. Her eyes would meet his, and for a moment that stretched into an eternity. The world would fall away. In his gaze, she no longer saw a captor, but a man haunted by a past he could not outrun, and he, in turn, looked at her as if she were a puzzle he could not solve, a patch of sunlight in the darkest winter of his life. These moments were dangerous, freighted with a meaning neither of them was ready to acknowledge. They would break away, their hearts beating a little too fast, and a flush of heat would rise in Clara's cheeks. She took to watching him from the cabin window as he worked. He had regained much of his strength, and the methodical, powerful swing of the axe as he split logs for the fire was mesmerizing. The muscles in his back and shoulders bunched and released beneath his worn shirt, each movement precise and controlled. There was no wasted effort, no flourish, just a raw, physical strength that was both frightening and compelling. She would watch the clean split of the wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe, and feel a confusing mix of emotions roil within her. This was the strength that had dragged her through the snow, the strength of an outlaw. Yet, there was a restraint in it, a focused discipline that spoke of a man at war with his own nature. A profound guilt would wash over her. She would think of Mr. Alistair Finch, the stern face in the photograph, the man whose name she carried, her husband, the life that had been stolen from her. She should be mourning him, honoring his memory. Instead, she was watching his killer chop wood and feeling a traitorous flutter in her chest. The spring thaw was slow, but relentless. The sound of melting snow, a constant dripping from the eaves of the cabin, became the new soundtrack to their lives. Patches of dark, wet earth began to appear on the south-facing slopes, and the creek that ran through the valley swelled with rushing, liberated water. The world was opening up, offering a path to freedom, the possibility of escape. Once a desperate, terrifying thought, now felt real and imminent, and with it came a new, more complicated tension. Soon, they would have to make a choice. Soon, this strange, suspended life would have to end. One night, the sky turned a bruised purple, and a low rumble of thunder echoed through the mountains. A storm rolled in, not of snow, but of cold, hard rain that hammered against the roof of the cabin like 1,000 angry fists. The wind rose, and with it, the ghosts of the past. Clara fell into a restless sleep, pursued by fragmented dreams. She saw the face of Mr. Finch, not stern as in the photograph, but twisted in terror. She heard the crack of gunfire, felt the lurch of the wagon, the warmth of Mr. Hemlock's blood soaking into her dress. She was under the wagon again, the world a nightmare of stomping boots and screams, and a voice was calling her name, a voice she did not recognize. A violent crack of thunder directly overhead ripped her from the dream. She sat bolt upright on her pallet of furs, a raw sob tearing from her throat. The cabin was dark. The fire burned down to a dull red glow. Tears streamed down her face, hot and unstoppable. She was not crying for the dream, but for everything it represented, for the life she had lost, for the people who had died, for the terrifying, lonely emptiness that was her future. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with the force of her grief. Suddenly, he was there, a warm, solid presence beside her in the darkness. She had not heard him move. Jack knelt beside her, and his hand came to rest on her back, a tentative, questioning touch. She flinched but did not pull away. He said nothing. He simply held her, his hand rubbing slow, comforting circles between her shoulder blades. He was an anchor in the storm of her sorrow. She leaned into his touch, the sobs gradually subsiding into shuddering breaths. He held her without words until the trembling stopped, until the only sounds were the rain on the roof and the quiet, shared rhythm of their breathing. She turned her head, her tear-streaked face just inches from his in the faint firelight. His expression was unguarded, stripped of its usual hardness. He looked at her with a raw tenderness that made her breath catch in her throat. The space between them disappeared. He leaned in slowly, his eyes never leaving hers, and she felt herself leaning forward to meet him. Their lips were about to touch when he froze. A look of profound shame, of self-loathing, passed over his face. He pulled back abruptly, as if he had been burned. "I cannot," he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion she could not name. He rose and retreated to his side of the cabin, turning his back to her, a rigid silhouette against the dying embers. The next morning, the air was thick with unspoken things. The rain had stopped, but the sky was a blanket of gray clouds. Clara could not let it go. The memory of his touch, of his gentleness, followed by his sharp rejection, had left her feeling raw and exposed. She found him outside, staring out at the misty valley. "You wanted to kiss me last night," she said. It was not a question, but an accusation. He did not turn around. You were upset. You did not know what you were doing.
And you did?
She pressed, stepping closer.
You wanted me.
He turned to face her then, his eyes hard, his jaw tight. You are imagining things, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. His gaze slid away from hers, unable to meet the challenge in her eyes. His denial was a lie, and they both knew it.
Do not lie to me,
she said, her voice low and fierce. Not about this. What do you want from me, Clara? He shot back, his frustration finally boiling over. Do you want me to say it? Fine. Is this what you want to hear? That a man who has lived in filth his whole life looks at a woman like you and wants something clean? Something he has no right to touch? His voice was full of a bitter, self-deprecating anger. Well, I will not be that man. I will not drag you down any further than I already have. Their arguments became more frequent after that, and more heated. They fought about everything and nothing. When they should leave the cabin, which direction they should go, how to ration the last of the food. But beneath the harsh words was a current of desperation. Each argument was a test, a way of pushing the other to see how much they could bear, what they were really saying, in a language of pride and pain that neither could translate, was, "Do not leave me. I am afraid to be alone." One afternoon, while he was out checking his snares, she decided to mend the tear in his coat, the one he had been wearing during the ambush. It was a simple, domestic task, a way to keep her hands busy. As she stitched the thick wool, her fingers brushed against something stiff in the lining of the pocket. Curious. She worked it free. It was a piece of paper, folded into a small, tight square, worn and softened from being carried for a long time. She unfolded it. It was a wanted poster. The paper was cheap. The drawing a crude but recognizable sketch of his face. Beneath it, the words were stark and brutal. Wanted, dead or alive. Jack. Blackheart. Sullivan for robbery and murder. Associate of the notorious Silas Blackwood gang. $500 reward. Jack Sullivan. So that was his name. Blackheart. The words seemed absurd. A name given to a monster in a penny dreadful, not to the man who had held her while she wept. $500. It was a fortune. More money than she had ever seen in her life. Enough to buy a ticket on a train to anywhere. Enough to start over, to build a new life from the ashes of the old one. All she had to do was walk away from this cabin, find the marshal, and tell him where to find the man who was worth $500. Dead or alive. She sank onto the edge of the cot, the poster trembling in her hand. Justice demanded it. The memory of the dead demanded it. Her own stolen future demanded it. But when she closed her eyes, she did not see the faces of the dead. She saw Jack's face, his eyes full of a pain that mirrored her own. She felt his hand on her back, steady and warm in the darkness. She heard his quiet, broken laughter mingling with hers. She could not do it. With trembling fingers, she folded the poster back into its small, tight square and tucked it deep into a hidden pocket of her own worn dress. She did not know what it meant. This choice, it was not forgiveness. It was something more complicated. A loyalty born of shared suffering. A recognition that the world was not as simple as good men and bad men. She had chosen her side. That night, the storm returned with a vengeance. The thunder was not a distant rumble, but a series of violent, earth-shaking explosions. Lightning lit the cabin in stark, flashing tableaus of white and black. The wind howled like a legion of banshees, tearing at the roof and rattling the door in its frame. They sat by the fire, the storm outside a perfect mirror of the tempest inside them. He knew. She did not know how, but when he looked at her, she saw the knowledge in his eyes. He knew she had found the poster. He knew she had seen his name and his price, and he knew that she had not run. The tension finally snapped. He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides and stood before her. He did not touch her, but his presence was overwhelming. "You should have left," he said. his voice a raw whisper against the roar of the wind. "You should have run the first chance you got."
"Where would I have gone?"
she whispered back, her voice shaking. "Anywhere but here," he said, his gaze intense, full of a desperate, pleading anguish. "Anywhere but with me."
"Maybe I do not want to be anywhere else,"
she confessed, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. That was all it took. He made a sound, a groan that was part of the storm, and his mouth came down on hers. It was not a gentle kiss, it was rough and desperate and hungry. It was a kiss full of all the anger and fear and loneliness they had carried for so long. She kissed him back with equal fire, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. It was a collision, a surrender, a desperate clinging of two haunted souls who had found their only solace in each other. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to the pallet of furs, the thunder outside swallowing the sound of their ragged breaths. They came together in the flickering firelight, not as captor and captive, but as equals in their brokenness, seeking a moment of fierce, obliterating comfort in the heart of the storm. The storm was gone. In its place, the morning brought a heavy, profound silence that was more damning than any thunder. The light that seeped through the grimy window was pale and gray, illuminating a scene of quiet devastation. The fire was dead, a heap of black ash in the cold hearth. The furs on which they had lain were a tangled mess. A cold draft snaked across the floor, a reminder that the world outside was waiting to reclaim them. Clara awoke first. She lay perfectly still, her back to him, every muscle in her body taut. The memory of the night was a brand on her skin, a searing heat that had nothing to do with warmth. It had been a desperate, wild thing, a collision of two lonely souls in the dark, but in the unforgiving light of morning, it felt like a transgression, a profound and terrible mistake. A wave of shame so powerful it was physically nauseating washed over her. She was the widow of a man she had never met, and she had given herself to one of the men responsible for his death. The thought was a shard of ice in her gut. She felt him stir behind her, a slight shift in the furs, the sound of a ragged breath drawn. He did not touch her, he did not speak. The space between their bodies, which had been erased in the passion of the storm, was now a chasm 1,000 miles wide. The silence stretched, thick with regret and unspoken accusations. Finally, she could bear it no longer. A single, choked sob escaped her lips. Then another. She rolled onto her side, away from him, and pulled her knees to her chest, the tears coming in a hot, silent flood. She wept for the life she had lost, for the woman she had been just a few weeks ago, a woman who understood the world in simple terms of right and wrong. She wept for the shame that was now her constant companion. "It cannot mean anything," she whispered, her voice broken, muffled by the furs. "What happened last night? It was the storm. It was fear. It meant nothing." It was a desperate lie, a plea for him to absolve her, to let her rebuild the walls he had shattered. She heard him move, the rustle of his clothes as he sat up. He was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough sound, scraped raw with a pain that mirrored her own. "You are right," he said. "It meant nothing." But his voice broke on the last word, a small, almost imperceptible crack. It was the sound of a man agreeing to a lie that was tearing him apart. Clara's weeping subsided into a quiet, shuddering misery. The lie hung in the air between them, a shared and bitter poison. They had found a moment of solace in the dark, and the light had turned it to shame. They dressed in a grim, methodical silence, their movements stiff and awkward, their eyes refusing to meet. The intimacy of the night had made the cabin unbearable. Every familiar object, the hearth, the table, the pile of furs, was now a silent witness to their fall. "We have to leave," Jack said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He was already checking the rifle, his focus entirely on the practical mechanics of the weapon. "The thaw has set in for good. The passes will be clear enough soon. The marshal will be back." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. She began to pack, her hands moving with a numb efficiency. She gathered the last of the salted meat, the small bag of coffee, the tin cups. She rolled the furs into a tight bundle. Each task was an act of penance, a way to keep from thinking, from feeling. They were erasing their presence from this place, trying to erase the memory of what had happened here. When they were finished, the cabin looked almost as it had when they first stumbled into it, empty and cold. They stood by the open door, the fresh, damp air of morning on their faces. They did not look at each other. They looked out at the path that led away, a path that would take them back into a world that had no place for them. Their journey was a silent one. Jack took the lead, breaking a trail through the softening, slushy snow, his steps heavy. Clara followed a few paces behind, her gaze fixed on the ground. The world was loud with the sound of running water, of a world coming back to life, but between them there was only a dead, empty quiet. They reached the river by midday. It was no longer the quiet, frozen creek of a few weeks ago. It was a churning, angry torrent of brown water, swollen with melt, carrying branches and chunks of ice in its powerful current. A line of slick, mossy stones offered the only path across. "Stay close behind me," Jack ordered, his voice all business. "Step where I step. Do not look down." He started across, moving with a careful, deliberate balance, the rifle held high. Clara followed, her heart pounding. The roar of the water was deafening. The spray was cold on her face. She was halfway across, her feet slipping on the wet stone, when a shout from the far bank made her look up. 3 men stood there, their horses tethered behind them. They were rough-looking men, with shaggy beards and clothes that had seen hard miles. They were not lawmen. Their eyes were hungry, predatory, vultures. One of them, a big man with a greasy leather vest, pointed a grimy finger at Jack. "Well, look what the river washed up," he sneered. "If it is not Jack Blackheart Sullivan himself. $500. Boys, and he has brought us a pretty little bonus." Jack froze, his body going rigid. He slowly turned, placing himself between Clara and the men on the bank. "Keep moving, Clara," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Get to the other side, now!" But it was too late. The men were drawing their pistols. "Not so fast, Sullivan," the leader said, a wide, cruel grin spreading across his face. "We will take the woman first. A little company for the ride back to town, then we will take your head." Everything happened in a blur. Jack shoved Clara backward, toward the bank they had just left. "Run!" he yelled, and in the same motion, he brought the rifle to his shoulder. A shot cracked, louder than the roar of the river, and the man in the leather vest staggered back, a look of shocked surprise on his face, a dark hole appearing in his chest. The other 2 men opened fire. The air was filled with the whine of bullets and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Jack fired again, and one of the men screamed and clutched his arm. Clara scrambled back onto the bank, her feet sinking into the muddy snow. She watched in horror as Jack, exposed on the rocks, became the sole target. He was turning, trying to get back to her, when a bullet slammed into his left shoulder. The impact spun him around, and he cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pain. He stumbled, his boot slipping on the slick stone, and fell into the churning water. "Jack!" Clara screamed. The current seized him immediately, pulling him under. He surfaced a few yards downstream, gasping, his face pale with shock. He was trying to swim, but his left arm was useless, and the weight of his coat was dragging him down. The remaining bounty hunter, the one with the wounded arm, was taking aim, preparing to finish him off. Clara did not think. She ran along the riverbank, her eyes locked on Jack. She saw a thick, low-hanging branch of a fallen tree dipping into the water. She grabbed it, leaning out as far as she could. "Jack, here!" she screamed, her voice raw. He saw her. With a final, desperate surge of strength, he reached for the branch. His fingers brushed it, then clamped on. The current fought to pull him away, but he held on, his knuckles white. The bounty hunter fired again, the bullet splashing into the water just inches from Jack's head. Clara pulled with all her might. She was not strong enough to pull him from the river, but her anchor gave him the leverage he needed to fight his way out of the main current and into the shallower water near the bank. He crawled, half drowned and bleeding, onto the muddy shore, collapsing at her feet. She did not hesitate. She grabbed the collar of his coat and began to drag him. The bounty hunter was reloading, shouting curses at them. She dragged Jack back, away from the river, into the thick cover of the pine trees. Every muscle in her body strained. He was a dead weight, his boots leaving deep furrows in the snow. She could hear the bounty hunter crashing through the undergrowth behind them. Just ahead, she saw a dark opening in the side of a rocky hill, partially hidden by overgrown bushes, an old mine shaft, with a final, desperate burst of adrenaline. She hauled Jack toward it, pulling him into the dark. Narrow opening just as the bounty hunter broke through the trees. They scrambled deeper into the blackness, the sound of their ragged breathing echoing off the damp stone walls. They heard the man outside, cursing their luck, before his footsteps finally faded away. They were safe, for now. They were in a cold, dark tomb, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. Water dripped from the ceiling, a slow, steady rhythm in the darkness. Clara gently lowered Jack to the ground. He was shivering, his clothes soaked, his face ashen.
"We have to get a fire going,"
she whispered, her voice trembling. She fumbled in his coat pocket until she found his flint and steel. She gathered splinters of wood from an old timber support and, after several frustrating attempts, managed to coax a small, pitiful flame to life. In the weak, flickering light, she saw the extent of his new wound. The bullet had gone clean through the thick muscle of his shoulder. It was bleeding freely, staining his wet coat a dark, glistening red. She tore a strip from her petticoat, the second time she had done so for his sake, and pressed it hard against the wound to stanch the bleeding. He lay with his head in her lap, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. For a long time, the only sounds were the dripping water and his pained breaths. "You should have run," he finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "You should have left me."
"And what then?"
she replied softly, her hand stroking the wet hair back from his forehead.
"You would be dead."
"Better me than both of us." "Be quiet," she said, her voice firm. "Save your strength." He was silent for a while, his body trembling with cold and pain. Then he began to speak, his voice low and halting, the words a confession he had held inside for too long. "Silas Blackwood," he began. "He and we grew up in the same dirt. After my family was killed, my brother hanged. I was filled with a hate so big it did not leave room for anything else. Silas, he felt it too. His family was cheated out of their land by the same railroad men. We wanted revenge. We started a gang. At first, it was just that we hit their payrolls, their supply lines. We hurt them where they were strongest, in their pockets. It felt like justice." He paused, taking a shuddering breath. "But the hate, it twists a man. It turns to greed. Silas, he started changing. It stopped being about justice and started being about the money. He started bringing in harder men who enjoyed the cruelty. It got uglier. We were not just hurting the railroad anymore. We were hurting anyone who got in our way." Clara listened, her heart aching for the lost boy who had only wanted to avenge his family. "I tried to leave," Jack continued, his voice thick with shame. "More than once. But Silas, he would not let me go. He said I was in it for life. The wagon train. That was the end for me. I told him no. There were families, women, children. It was not our way. But he did not listen. He and the others. They were drunk on the idea of the payroll the wagons were supposed to be carrying. When the shooting started, I tried to stop it. I fired a shot in the air, tried to get them to just take the goods and leave. That is when they turned on me. One of Silas's new men shot me in the side. They took the money, what little there was, and left me for dead. They thought the storm would finish me. They spread the rumor that I was the leader, that I was Silas Blackwood, so the law would be hunting me instead of them. He fell silent. The story told, he had finally given her the whole truth. He was guilty of many things, but not of the crime that had bound them together. She looked down at his pale, exhausted face in the firelight.
You still have a choice, Jack,
she said softly.
You can still live differently. We can go somewhere new, somewhere they do not know your name. We can start over.
A bitter laugh, weak and full of despair, escaped his lips. It is too late for men like me. Clara, he whispered, there is no starting over. This life, it marks you. There is no washing it off. He tried to push himself up. You need to go, now, before that bounty hunter comes back with his friends. You can tell them I took you against your will. They will believe you. No, she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. She pushed him gently back down. I am not leaving you. Clara, you have to, he pleaded, a new urgency in his voice. I will not have your death on my conscience as well.
Then you will have to live, she replied. Because I am not leaving.
She stayed beside him through the long, dark night, holding the makeshift bandage to his shoulder, giving him small sips of water. She talked to him in a low voice, telling him about the farm where she grew up, about the wildflowers that bloomed in the spring, about anything and everything to keep his mind off the pain, to keep him tethered to the world. As the first faint gray light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the rock at the mouth of the mine, she reached into her dress and pulled out the folded, worn paper. His wanted poster. He watched, his eyes full of a weary confusion, as she held it to the edge of the small fire. The paper caught, curling at the edges, the crude drawing of his face blackening and turning to ash. She turned back to him, her face illuminated by the tiny flame.
If you die,
she said, her voice soft but fierce,
I will die too.
A tremor ran through his body that had nothing to do with the cold or his wounds. He reached up with his good hand and took hers, his grip surprisingly strong. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture of such reverence and humility that it made her heart ache. I do not deserve this, he whispered, and for the first time, his voice trembled, raw with an emotion he could no longer contain. Your forgiveness. He held onto her hand as if it were the only thing keeping him alive. Exhaustion finally claimed them both. They fell asleep in the cold, damp darkness of the mine, their hands clasped together. As the new day dawned on the world outside, they awoke to the distant, rhythmic pop of a gunshot echoing through the valley. It was followed by another. The sound was sharp and clear in the crisp morning air, a brutal intrusion into their fragile peace. Jack was on his feet in an instant, his body tense, his hand reaching for the rifle he no longer had. He peered out from the mouth of the mine, his face a grim mask. A search party, he said, his voice a low, flat whisper. They found the cabin. They will find the tracks from the river. Clara's blood ran cold. She came to his side, her hand finding his good arm.
What do we do?
We do not have a choice, he said, his gaze fixed on the valley below. There is no running from this. Not for me. He turned to face her, his eyes dark with a terrible resolve. He took her by the shoulders, his grip firm. Clara, you listen to me. When they find us, you walk out first. You tell them I took you. You tell them I forced you to help me, that you were my prisoner the whole time. You scream, you cry. You do whatever you have to do to make them believe you. Do you understand? She stared at him, her heart shattering.
No,
she whispered.
I will not leave you.
You must, he insisted, his voice raw with urgency. They will hang me either way. But you
You can still have a life. You can walk away from this. My life is with you now, she said, her voice fierce, her chin lifting in defiance. I will not lie for you. I will not abandon you. A look of profound anguish crossed his face. You do not understand. They will see you as my accomplice. They will lock you away. Or worse, I will not let that happen. I will not be the man who destroys you completely. You are the man who saved me, she countered, her hands clutching the front of his shirt. The sound of men's voices, closer now, drifted up to them. There was no more time. He looked down at her, and in that moment, all the hardness, all the walls he had built around his heart, crumbled. He pulled her into a fierce, desperate embrace, his face buried in her hair. I love you, he whispered, the words a painful, beautiful confession torn from the depths of his soul. But the world will not let me have you. Now go. Before she could protest, he was pushing her, forcing her back toward the mouth of the mine. She struggled, but he was stronger. He pushed her out from the darkness of the cave and into the brilliant, unforgiving sunlight. Tell them I forced you, he commanded, his voice a harsh echo from the shadows. Live, Clara, live. She stumbled into the clearing, blinking against the light. A line of men on horseback, their rifles raised, were staring at her. The marshal she had seen before was at their head, his face a grim mask of satisfaction. It is over! Sullivan! The marshal shouted toward the mine. Send the woman out and come out with your hands empty! Clara turned, her face streaked with tears, and saw Jack step out from the darkness behind her. He was unarmed, his empty hands held away from his sides. His left arm was in a makeshift sling, his shirt stained with blood, but he stood tall, his gaze meeting the marshal's without fear. He looked only at her one last time, his eyes full of a love so powerful it took her breath away. No! Clara screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. Jack! He stepped forward, away from her, a clear act of surrender. The lawmen closed in, their rifles still trained on him. The marshal dismounted, a pair of iron manacles in his hand. Jack Sullivan, the marshal said, his voice ringing with grim authority. You are under arrest for the robbery and murder of the Hemlock Party. You are wrong, Clara cried, running forward. Two deputies blocked her path, their faces impassive. He did not do it. He saved me. You have to listen. The marshal ignored her, snapping the cuffs onto Jack's wrists. Tell your story to the judge, he said coldly. They took him away, forcing him onto the back of a horse. Clara fought against the men holding her, her pleas lost in the wind. She was no longer a captive, but she had never felt less free. As the procession started to move, Jack turned in his saddle, his eyes finding hers. He did not speak, but the message was clear. Live. She followed them. She walked for miles behind the horses, her feet raw, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She would not abandon him. She would walk into the lion's den, into the heart of their so-called justice, and she would make them listen. The town was little more than a dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a place called Redemption that seemed to offer anything but. As they rode in, people emerged from the saloon and the general store, their faces a mixture of curiosity and hard-bitten judgment. They stared at the captured outlaw, and then at the disheveled woman trailing behind him like a ghost. Whispers followed her, sharp and cruel as stones. The trial was a swift and brutal affair, held in the main room of the saloon. A circuit judge, a weary man with eyes that had seen too much of the West's casual cruelty, presided from behind a poker table. The room was packed with miners, ranchers, and townspeople, their face a sea of grim expectation. Jack stood before the judge, flanked by deputies, his face pale but his posture unbowed. Clara sat on a bench near the front, her hands clenched in her lap. The testimony was short. The marshal described finding the bodies, tracking the outlaw, and capturing him.
A man from the town identified Jack as a known associate of the Silas Blackwood gang. It was a neat and tidy story, with no room for truth. "Does anyone wish to speak on behalf of the accused?" the judge asked, his voice flat, already weary of the inevitable conclusion.
"I do," Clara said, her voice clear and strong. She stood up, and a hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to her. She walked to the front and stood beside Jack, turning to face the crowd. "My name is Clara Thompson," she began, her gaze sweeping over the silent, staring faces. "I was on that wagon train. I saw what happened. The men who attacked us were animals. But this man," she said, turning to look at Jack, her voice softening. "This man is not one of them." A skeptical murmur rippled through the crowd. "When the shooting was over, I was alone. He found me. He had a gun, and I was at his mercy. He could have done anything to me. He could have left me to freeze in the storm, but he did not. He dragged me to shelter. He kept me alive. When a fever from his wound nearly took him, I tended to him, and I saw the scars on his body, the scars of a life of pain I can only imagine. When the law came, he hid me, protecting me even from the men who were supposed to be my saviors." She took a deep breath, her voice ringing with a conviction that came from her very soul. "We were trapped together for weeks, and in that time, I did not see a monster. I saw a man haunted by his past, a man who showed me more kindness and respect than I have ever known. He told me the truth. His gang turned on him. He was left for dead because he tried to stop the senseless killing. The man you want, the man who led that raid, is Silas Blackwood. This man is guilty of running with the wrong crowd, but he is not the murderer you are looking for." She finished, her chest heaving, her eyes pleading with the judge, with the townspeople, with anyone who would listen. For a moment, there was only silence. She saw a flicker of doubt in some of the faces, a glimmer of sympathy in the eyes of a few of the women, but then the prejudice, the hard certainty of the frontier, settled back into place. Justice in the West was a simple, brutal equation, and they already had their answer. The judge cleared his throat. "A compelling story, Miss—" But he was there. He admits he was there. The law is the law. He looked at Jack, his face impassive. "Jack Sullivan, for your part in the crimes committed against the Hemlock Party, I sentence you to hang by the neck until dead. The sentence will be carried out at dawn." A gavel that was really the bottom of a whiskey bottle banged on the table. It was over. That night, they let her see him. She stood outside his cell in the small, stone jail, the air thick with the smell of rust and despair. He came to the bars, his hands gripping the cold iron. "You should not have done that, Clara," he said, his voice rough with unshed tears. "You should not have defended me." "I only spoke the truth," she whispered, reaching through the bars to touch his face. His skin was cold. "I love you, Jack Sullivan." "I love you too," he said, leaning his forehead against the bars. "More than you will ever know." They stayed like that for a long time, their fingers intertwined through the iron grid, their quiet words a final, desperate testament to a love that had been born in a storm and was now to die in a cage. "I will always love you," she said as the deputy came to take her away. "Always." Dawn broke, cold and gray. The whole town had gathered in the dusty street to watch. A raw wooden gallows had been erected in front of the jail. Clara stood at the edge of the crowd, her body numb, her soul an empty, aching void. They brought him out, his hands bound behind him, a black hood held ready by the hangman. He walked to the gallows, his steps steady. His eyes found her in the crowd, and he gave her a small, sad smile. He was on the platform, the rope being fitted around his neck, when a shout came from the far end of the street. "Fire! The livery is on fire!" Heads turned. A thick column of black smoke was billowing into the morning sky from the direction of the livery stable. In that moment of distraction, a second shout came from the other side of the crowd.
The jail's on fire too! Flames were suddenly licking out of the windows of the small stone jailhouse, the dry wood of the roof catching with a roar. Panic erupted. The crowd surged back. The deputies on the gallows were momentarily paralyzed by confusion, torn between the execution, the fires, and the panicked crowd. In that single chaotic instant, a figure darted from the crowd. A knife flashed, and the ropes binding Jack's hands fell away. Someone shoved him from the back of the gallows, and he disappeared into the thick, rolling smoke and the screaming mob. When the fires were finally extinguished and the smoke cleared, the town was in shambles. The livery was a heap of charred timbers. The jail was a gutted, blackened shell. And Jack Sullivan and the strange woman who had defended him were gone. In the years that followed, the story became a legend, told around campfires and in dusty saloons across the territory. Some said the outlaw and his woman had died together in the blaze, their love consumed by the flames of justice. Others whispered that unknown friends, loyal members of his old gang, had set the fires as a diversion. But the most popular story, the one told by old men with a hopeful glint in their eyes, was that they had simply vanished, that they had slipped through the chaos and walked away, heading back into the vast, lonely mountains where their story had begun. No one ever saw them again. There was no body, no trail, no trace. There was only the empty trapper's cabin, standing silent against the seasons, and in the spring, where the blood-soaked snow had once lain, a patch of wild bluebells bloomed, their color as bright and startling as a new beginning, and leading away from the cabin, heading deep into the untamed heart of the wilderness, were two sets of footprints, side by side, that went on until they disappeared completely. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans. And we invite you to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.